Daniel had never considered himself the type of man who wandered. He was 38, married for 11 years to Rachel, and together they had 2 children, a boy named Ethan who was obsessed with dinosaurs, and a younger girl, Lily, who still insisted on sleeping with 3 stuffed animals arranged in a particular order. He worked in logistics for a shipping company outside Columbus, Ohio, coached Ethan's soccer team on Saturday mornings, and considered his life, on the whole, to be a good one. Steady, ordinary in the best sense of the word. It started, as these things often do, with something completely unremarkable. There was a parents' group chat for the elementary school, the kind every school seemed to have now, full of reminders about bake sales and half-day schedules. Daniel rarely posted in it. He mostly muted it and checked it once a week. So when a woman named Vanessa messaged him directly, asking about a set of used textbooks he'd offered to give away, he didn't think twice about it. "Hi, I saw your post about the math workbooks. Are they still available?" "Yes, still have them. You can grab them anytime. I'm usually home in the evenings." "Would it be possible for you to drop them off?" "I don't have a car right now. Mine's in the shop." He hesitated over that message for longer than he needed to. Something about it felt slightly like an imposition, though he couldn't have explained why. In the end, he decided it was a small favor, the kind any decent neighbor would do, and he told himself that was the whole of it. A week later, on a Thursday evening, he loaded the workbooks into his car and drove over with Rachel and the kids in the back seat, since they were already headed out for dinner. Vanessa's husband answered the door and took the box with a polite nod of thanks. Daniel didn't even see her face that evening. A few days after, a message arrived. "Thank you so much for bringing those over. Ethan's mom is a lifesaver." He replied with something brief and friendly, and the conversation ended there. For 3 months, nothing. Then, out of nowhere, she messaged again, this time about something happening at the school, a scheduling change for pickup that had confused several parents. It was a practical question, nothing more, and Daniel answered it the way he would have answered anyone. But this time, the conversation didn't end after one exchange. It drifted, the way conversations sometimes do, into other subjects. She asked where he was originally from. He told her. She mentioned that she and her husband were saving to buy land back in their home country, something they hoped to do within the next several years. Daniel felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, because he and Rachel had been having nearly the same conversation at their own kitchen table for the past year, weighing whether to buy property back home as an investment or wait until retirement. It felt, to him, like an unusually specific coincidence, a shared interest that neither his co-workers nor most of his friends seemed to care about. His closest friend at work, a man named Greg who sat 2 desks over and talked mostly about fantasy football, had zero interest in property investments or exchange rates or the complicated business of buying land through relatives who couldn't be fully trusted. Daniel found himself looking forward to Vanessa's replies in a way he didn't examine too closely at the time, telling himself it was simply refreshing to talk to someone who understood a particular kind of homesickness, the kind that never quite goes away no matter how many years pass in a new country. There was, if he was honest with himself later, a specific feeling attached to those early messages, something he hadn't felt in a long while. It wasn't excitement exactly, it was closer to being seen. Rachel knew him thoroughly, in the deep, practical way that 11 years of marriage produces, the way that includes knowing his coffee order and his blood pressure numbers and which of his relatives to avoid inviting to the same gathering. But there was something different about being asked, by someone new, what he thought about things, what he remembered from childhood, what he actually wanted for his own future, rather than the family's future. Vanessa asked those kinds of questions often, and Daniel answered them freely, never once stopping to consider why a woman he barely knew was asking him things his own wife had stopped asking years earlier, mostly because she already knew the answers. Over the following months, the conversation continued at an unhurried pace. They discussed property prices, exchange rates, the frustration of dealing with relatives back home who promised to keep an eye on things and never did. Somewhere in that stretch of time, without either of them naming it directly, the conversation widened beyond property and started including smaller, more personal details. Her taste in music, a difficult week she'd had with one of her children, a memory from her childhood that had nothing to do with anything practical at all. Several times she pulled back on her own. "We should not bother such things," she wrote once, telling him plainly that they shouldn't be having these kinds of conversations, that it wasn't appropriate for two people who weren't married to each other. Daniel agreed with her in the moment, told her she was right, and then, within a week or two, the conversation would find its way back to the same easy familiarity as before. Neither of them ever fully stopped it. If you are enjoying this story so far, please like this video and subscribe for more emotional English stories. Now, let's continue. He began noticing which songs she mentioned liking and started putting them on his own social media status. A small and seemingly harmless gesture that she would react to with a laughing emoji or a short comment. It became a kind of private rhythm between them, invisible to everyone else scrolling past it. Rachel never asked about the statuses. Why would she? To her, they looked like nothing at all. Just songs. This went on for over 2 years. Not constant, not obsessive, but present. A steady undercurrent running beneath Daniel's regular life. He told himself repeatedly that nothing was actually happening. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't said anything explicitly romantic. He was simply talking to a friend, someone who understood a particular kind of homesickness that people who'd never left their country could never fully grasp. That was the story he told himself, and for a long time, it was convincing enough. Then came the morning that changed everything. He'd been thinking about her more than usual that week, turning over a passing comment she'd made about needing space for a few days. Without fully planning what he was about to write, he typed out a message that had clearly been building somewhere beneath the surface for a long time. "I really want to talk to you more these days, but I feel like I should keep some distance, in case it upsets you." "It won't upset me," she wrote back. "Are you sure? Is it all right if I say something?" "Yes, go ahead." He typed the next part slowly, believing, in some strange way, that what he was about to ask came from a place of consideration rather than intrusion. "Look, I think I understand your mood swings by now, but I still haven't figured out exactly which days they happen. I want to know your period dates, so I can be more careful with you." The reply took nearly 10 minutes to arrive, and when it did, it was short. "We shouldn't talk anymore." He tried to explain himself, told her he hadn't meant anything wrong by it, that he only wanted to understand her better so he wouldn't accidentally upset her in the future. She didn't respond to any of it. A day later, he noticed her profile picture no longer appeared next to her name in his messages. She had removed him entirely. For the first few days, Daniel told himself she would come around, that she was simply embarrassed, or overreacting to a question that, in his mind, had come from genuine care rather than anything inappropriate. He drafted several apology messages he never sent, deleting each one after rereading it, and deciding it sounded either too desperate or not sincere enough. It was Rachel, oddly, who first made him confront what had actually happened, though she had no idea about any of it. One evening, about 2 weeks after the messages stopped, she was folding laundry in their bedroom while he sat on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone with the particular blankness of someone thinking about something else entirely. "You've been somewhere else lately," Rachel said, not looking up from the shirt she was folding. "Not here. I don't know how else to say it. I'm just tired," Daniel said. "Work's been a lot." "Maybe," Rachel said. She set the shirt down and looked at him directly. "Or maybe you've been somewhere else for longer than just this week. I don't know. You tell me." He didn't answer right away, and the silence between them stretched out long enough that it became its own kind of answer. "Is there something going on?" she asked, quieter now, less accusatory than genuinely searching. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. He thought about denying it outright, the way he had been denying it to himself for 2 years. But looking at his wife, at the small, tired lines near her eyes that came from raising 2 children and holding their household together while he'd been distracted by conversations he had never once mentioned to her, he found he couldn't quite manage the lie. "There was someone," he said carefully. "A woman from the school group. It wasn't physical. It wasn't anything like that. But I talked to her a lot, for a long time, about things I probably should have been talking to you about instead." Rachel's face didn't crumble the way he might have expected. Instead, it went very still. The kind of stillness that comes right before a person decides how much of themselves to show you. "How long?" she asked. "About 2 years. 2 years," she repeated, letting the number sit in the room between them. "And you never once thought that was worth mentioning to me?" "I told myself it was nothing, that it was just talking. People don't hide just talking for 2 years, Daniel." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made him look away from her. "You don't put someone's favorite songs on your status because it's nothing. You don't remember details like that about someone who's nothing." He didn't have a real answer for that, because she was right, and some part of him had known she was right the entire time, buried under 2 years of careful justification. They didn't resolve everything that night. Rachel asked for space, and Daniel gave it to her, sleeping on the couch for the better part of a week while she processed what he'd told her. It wasn't a clean, dramatic ending, the kind you see resolved neatly within a single conversation. It was slower and more uncomfortable than that, full of short, tense exchanges and long silences at the dinner table that the children, thankfully, seemed too young to fully notice. What Daniel came to understand, in the weeks that followed, wasn't really about whether Vanessa would ever speak to him again. He'd assumed, at first, that this was the central question, the thing keeping him awake at night. But as the initial sting of her silence faded, he realized the question had never actually mattered as much as he'd told himself it did. What mattered was the 2 years he had spent quietly investing pieces of himself, his attention, his curiosity, his easy laughter, into a connection that had no business existing outside his marriage in the first place, all while telling himself it was harmless because nothing had technically happened. He thought back to the moment he'd asked her that final question, the one that had ended everything so abruptly. At the time, he genuinely believed it came from care, from wanting to understand her better. Looking back now, with some distance, he could see it for what it actually was. A question far too intimate for the kind of relationship he'd convinced himself they had. It was the kind of question that belonged only inside a marriage, asked with the trust and closeness that comes from an actual, committed partnership, not from 2 years of secretive messaging with someone else's wife. He began seeing a counselor, something he'd never have considered doing a year earlier, mostly because Rachel had asked him to, and partly because he genuinely wanted to understand why he'd allowed something so seemingly small to grow into something that had nearly cost him his marriage. In one of those sessions, the counselor asked him a simple question that stayed with him longer than almost anything else that came up during those months. What were you actually looking for in those conversations? Daniel had sat with that question for a long moment before answering honestly. I think I wanted to feel interesting again, like someone was genuinely curious about me, not just about what I could do for the family. I don't think I even realized how much I missed that until she started asking. And did you ever consider that Rachel might have wanted the exact same thing from you? That question landed harder than he expected, because the truth was, he hadn't considered it, not once, in 2 years of conversations about property and songs and mood swings. He had been so focused on being noticed that he had stopped noticing the person right beside him. The counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Patel, who kept a small collection of succulents lined up along her windowsill, leaned forward slightly. You said earlier that nothing physical happened between you and this woman, and that this is part of how you justified it to yourself. I want to ask you something. If Rachel had done exactly what you did, spent 2 years talking daily with a man from her own circle, sharing songs, sharing memories, asking him personal questions about his body near the end, would the absence of anything physical make it feel acceptable to you? Daniel felt his jaw tighten before he even had words for the feeling. No, he admitted, it wouldn't feel acceptable at all. It would feel like the worst thing that had ever happened to us. So the standard you applied to yourself wasn't really a standard you believed in, Dr. Patel said, not unkindly. It was a story you needed in order to keep doing something you already suspected was wrong. He didn't have a response to that, not right away. It was the kind of observation that didn't need arguing with, only sitting with. The way you sit with a bruise you didn't notice until someone presses on it directly. It took months, not weeks, for things between Daniel and Rachel to find something resembling steadiness again. There were nights when Rachel still brought it up, needing to ask questions she hadn't asked before, needing to hear him say certain things more than once before she could begin trusting them. Daniel answered every question as honestly as he could, resisting the urge to minimize or explain away what he'd done, because he understood, finally, that minimizing it was exactly how it had grown in the first place. He never heard from Vanessa again. Occasionally, on the school group chat, he would see her name attached to a comment about an upcoming event, and something in him would still register a small, uncomfortable pull of curiosity. But he no longer acted on it, and over time, even that pull grew quieter, the way most things do when you stop feeding them attention. One evening, nearly a year after that morning message that had ended everything, Daniel sat on the back porch with Rachel while the kids chased each other around the yard in the fading light. She was leaning against his shoulder, something she hadn't done easily for a long stretch of that difficult year. Do you ever think about her? Rachel asked quietly, not with anger this time, just genuine curiosity. Daniel considered lying, out of habit more than intention, and then decided against it. Sometimes, not the way you might think. I think about the version of myself who thought that was okay. That's the part that still bothers me, honestly. Not her, him. Rachel was quiet for a moment. I think that's the most honest thing you've said to me this whole year. I mean it, he said. I let myself believe I hadn't crossed a line because nothing physical happened. But there were 100 smaller lines before that one, and I stepped over every single one of them without noticing, because I never let myself look closely enough to see them. And now? Now I look, Daniel said. That's really the only thing that's different. I actually look. Rachel didn't answer right away. She simply reached over and took his hand, the way she used to years earlier, before children and mortgages and the slow, quiet drift that happens in every long marriage if nobody pays attention to it. It wasn't a grand, cinematic reconciliation. It was smaller than that, and more honest, built out of an entire year of difficult conversations, rather than a single dramatic moment. Out in the yard, Ethan shouted something about a dinosaur fossil he'd found buried in the flower bed, holding up what was almost certainly just a rock. Lily ran over to inspect it, with the serious concentration only a 6-year-old can manage. Daniel watched them for a moment, then looked over at his wife, who was watching them too, a small, tired smile on her face. He understood, finally, that the real question had never been about whether Vanessa would come back into his life. The real question was whether he would keep choosing, day after day, to stay fully present in the life he already had, instead of letting his attention drift toward something easier simply because it felt, for a while, like being noticed. That was a question he would have to keep answering. Not just once, but again and again, for as long as the marriage lasted. For the first time in over 2 years, he felt like he finally knew the right answer. If you liked this story, please like, comment, and share. More simple and emotional stories are coming soon.